Welcome to the Real News Network, live on Facebook and YouTube and I think Periscope and at therealnews.com. We're going to continue our conversation we've been having on the Real News about the fight within the Democratic Party, Donna Brazile's revelations, and as we go, a bit of a series that's going to unfold here with our guest, who I'll introduce in a moment, about just what is the prescription, one could say, for reform of the Democratic Party, if that's possible. And we're going to discuss whether or not it's worth the effort, and if so, what that might look like. But we're going to start with Donna Brazile. And in Donna Brazile's book, which I'm sure just about everybody who's watching this has heard about, if not already read, one of the more explosive things she exposed was a sort of financial shenanigan that the Clinton campaign had used to up the amount of money any individual could donate by giving a certain amount of money, a few $1,000s, to every state party, which in theory is supposed to be used for state funding of local elections, but instead 99%, apparently, according to Donna Brazile, of that money actually went back to the coffers of the Hillary campaign, back to the DNC, and then the Hillary campaign controlled that money. To quote Donna Brazile, she says, the states kept less than 0.5% of the $82 million they had amassed from the extravagant fundraisers Hillary's campaign was holding. It's interesting that if you actually do the math, because they accused Bernie Sanders of not raising hardly any money for the state campaigns, if you do the math, something like $850,000 or so actually stayed in the state campaigns once all this money gets transferred back to the control of the Hillary campaign. And Sanders raised $5 million for down-ticket Democrats, so he actually wound up raising more for down-ticket ballots than the Hillary campaign. At any rate, the revelations of Donna Brazile, which essentially amount to her accusing the DNC of rigging the primary, the Sanders-Clinton primary, and when Elizabeth Warren was asked directly, did you think it was rigged, she said yes. Well, it sparked a great deal of controversy, as you know. For example, this is what happened on CNN. We're going to run the Hillary Rosen clip.
For Democrats to spend a second relitigating this primary fight could not be, stupider. If we're going to take Donna at her word, then you have to read the whole excerpt, because what the excerpt said is Hillary Clinton bailed out the DNC financially and controlled the staffing of the DNC. But Donna also said in that excerpt, Nina and Don, that she went door to door at the DNC and could not find a single shred of evidence that the actual results of the primary were tilted one way or another. And so if we're going to comment on the book, we ought to go all the way and say that actually Donna said that she found no proof and no evidence at all that the system was rigged.
Since you want to go there, this is really about a DNC that lacks accountability and transparency, period.
Yeah,
and we can
maybe,
deal with more than one thing at a
issue.
time.
That's not about rigging an election.
We have to restore the faith and credibility of the Democratic Party, and statements like you're making doesn't help.
All right, let me introduce our guest, Norman Solomon. Norman is the co-founder of RootsAction.org, and he's co-author of a new report, Autopsy, the Democratic Party in Crisis. Thanks for joining us, Norman.
Thanks, Paul.
So there's kind of two arguments there. One, let's start with the first, that now's not the time to rehash all of this, that Trump represents a kind of, they are not using this language, but I will, a kind of neo-fascism. There's a broad front called the resistance, and people like Hillary Rosen and others are saying that this isn't a time to use their word relitigate what the DNC did or didn't do. There should just be a constructive outlook in terms of reforming the DNC. Don't rehash who did what to whom, and focus on attacking Trump. How do you respond to that?
Well, ideally, there's a united front against the horrific Trump presidency. There's not usefulness in being united behind bad strategies and undemocratic internal processes of the Democratic Party. After all, Democratic's the first name of the party. And when we see so clearly that contempt for basic democratic principles were in play and in force inside the Democratic National Committee, then it doesn't work to just shrug and say, well, that's the past, so let's move on. The reality is that the same basic forces, the political, corporate tendencies and power that held the DNC last year still control it this year. So it's all well and good to say, hey, just move on, but we can't move on without being real about what happened and what continues to be in play in terms of the top-down power at the DNC.
The media has, on the whole, been very antagonistic to Donna Brazile, well, at least the media I've seen, led, of course, by MSNBC, and I've seen CNN, especially in the first few days after Brazile's book was started to be released by the Washington Post. There was one report I saw was a CNN journalist who just lambasted Brazile. We couldn't find the clip, but NBC had released this agreement between the Clinton campaign and the DNC, and according to a couple of sentences in that agreement, the money that Clinton was controlling and the power she had over the DNC was all supposed to be directed towards the general election, which would have been appropriate. But NBC later actually, it got revealed when people look at the dates, and I understand NBC even had to retract this, that the dates actually showed it was clearly about the primary, and Donna Brazile clearly makes that this control of Clinton was all about the primary. But the attack continued. Here's Robbie Mook, a former campaign manager for Clinton, on CNN.
You know, politics is politics. People have to go there, go out there and say what they need to say. I think it's dangerous to say that this contest was rigged. We can't make the case to working people in this country that we're going to stand up for them and we're going to fight for them if we're fighting each other. We can't do that. Hillary Clinton won this primary with almost 4 million votes. That's a bigger lead than Barack Obama had over her when she lost and conceded in 2008. The idea that the DNC could rig a contest, frankly, is laughable. And here's the last thing I'll say. The caucus contests within the larger primary are the contests that are run by the party. The primary elections are run by secretaries of state. Those contests, the caucuses that were run by the party, Bernie Sanders won overwhelmingly. So if we look at what the party actually managed in this process, Bernie Sanders won those contests. I think we only won 3 of them, and we barely won Iowa. So there's just no evidence to back this up.
So, Norman, what do you make of that point? The caucuses were controlled by the party, Bernie won the majority, and the DNC didn't control the elections in the states. So how can you accuse the Clinton campaign and the DNC of rigging the primaries?
A significant side note, a footnote, is that the Iowa caucuses, pivotal at the very start of the season, were run in an extremely shabby and questionable way by the party. So if I were Robbie Mook, I wouldn't boast about how the caucuses were run by the party. But more fundamentally, getting hung up.
Hang on for a sec, Norman. What do you mean by run in a shabbily way?
Oh, the count of the votes during the Iowa caucus night where, you wouldn't accept at a student council race. It was funky, to say the least, problematic. There seemed to be thumbs on the scales in terms of just counting up in the caucus rooms who had won. And it's very dubious whether Hillary Clinton actually won the Iowa caucuses, even though officially she did. Fundamentally, whether we get caught up in the word rigged or not, the reality is, and we knew this way before Donna Brazile's book, the reality is that there was a tilted playing field. It was not a level playing field. The DNC was tilted for Hillary Clinton from 2015 on. And the reality is, as we know now from the Brazile book, that the Clinton campaign at the outset of the primary season had control over and veto power over who was hired in basic positions such as communications director at the DNC. So, people can try to clean up the mess like Robbie Mook, the campaign manager for Hillary Clinton. But the reality is it was wrong. It was wrong how the DNC operated. It was not even-handed. It was a violation of the DNC's own charter, which commits theoretically the party and the DNC to being even-handed throughout the nomination selection process for president. So there's a big problem. And unless the people at the top of the DNC acknowledge the problem, then we're fated and required really to keep fighting this battle.
And the battle includes not just the battle against Hillary Clinton, but people involved in this progressive wing, as people are calling it, of the Democratic Party, were also many of them dealing with the policies of Barack Obama. And in Donna Brazile's book, one of the interesting revelations was the extent to which the DNC, the party itself, was millions and millions of dollars in debt. And we know during the Obama years, a majority, I think, of state legislatures were taken over by the Republicans. At many levels, the party was kind of being demolished across the country. And it's interesting on CNN at the same time that when Hillary Rosen was on, there was a Republican, a former advisor to Bush, Scott Jennings, and he actually makes an interesting point about Obama's role. Let's roll that.
It is amazing to me what no one's pointing out, that the president of the United States at the time, Barack Obama, had left his Democrat National Committee in such a shambles that not only was Hillary Clinton having to fight off Bernie Sanders, but she knew that if she were to get the nomination, she had to simultaneously bail out the DNC so it could be a viable entity for the general election. And this really, to me, falls at the feet of Barack Obama, whose path of destruction through the Democratic Party for 8 years is completed by these Brazile revelations.
Now, I know that the right-wing use of Brazile is certainly not meant to kind of strengthen any progressive fight anywhere, and particularly not in the Democratic Party. But it seems to me what Jennings is saying has a lot to it. And when you look at Barack Obama's policies that led to such growth in inequality across the country, we know the numbers of something like 90% of the post-07-08 crash income gains went to less than 1% of the population. That plus the destruction of the infrastructure of the Democratic Party all helped create the conditions for the election of Trump. But certainly this needs to be part of the diagnosis too, doesn't it?
These are points that were elaborated on in great detail in the report released 3 days before the first excerpts from Donna Brazile's book came out, and that is the task force-driven report called Autopsy, the Democratic Party in Crisis, which I co-coordinated with Karen Bernal, the chair of the California Democratic Party Progressive Caucus. And everybody is invited, by the way, to go to the web, read that report, that autopsy report, at the website democraticautopsy.org. And one of the points that we emphasized throughout the autopsy is that in 8 years of the Obama administration, the president's affinity with, support for, and from Wall Street cut the legs out from under the traditional working class support for the Democratic Party. And the money problem that the DNC fell into with the neglect from President Obama was in its own right a huge problem, and also a marker and a tracker for the way in which the Obama presidency helped to get Obama obviously reelected, but was devastating for down ballot Democrats. When you have during the 8 years of the Obama administration a loss of more than 1,000 state legislative seats, loss of Democrats to Republicans around the country, when you lose the Senate and you lose the House on Capitol Hill, and somehow the president comes up high and dry and keeps hobnobbing with and stocking his cabinet with all these corporate flacks, and in some cases billionaires like Penny Pritzker as Secretary of Commerce, who helped to bankroll Obama's political career in the first place, then it is a fundamental problem about the Democratic Party at the top. And there are really no indications that the governing body of the National Party, the DNC, has come to terms with that reality in any way other than continuing it. So this is what the battle is really about. As we come to the last weeks of 2017, when we look to the elections coming up in 2018 and beyond, is the struggle for the Democratic Party. Will it be the party of Main Street or Wall Street? And the claim, and incidentally, Donna Brazile is a longtime Clinton loyalist, but she's willing to look out for herself now and sell the books and so forth. But the reality is that the power structure at the DNC that Donna Brazile has always been part of, and that the current chair, Tom Perez, is very much part of, that power structure is all about serving the donor class, the big donors, those who can provide six-figure checks with the flick of a hand in the checkbook. And the pretense, the fallacy, and the betrayal, really, of working class people, of young people, of people of color, from the hierarchy of the Democratic Party, is the claim that somehow we're going to be getting along with Wall Street and we're going to help Main Street. And we saw, and you alluded to the transfer of wealth further upward, Paul, during the Obama administration. This is an absolute falsehood. And this is, in reality, a division of labor that is being called for and enforced by those in power, the Democratic Party, that effectively they look at working class people as those who are supposed to come up with a requisite number of votes during an election, but it's the people who are at the top donor strata, Wall Street, the big corporations, those who serve and represent and are at the top of the big banks. They are the ones who are the masters, largely, of National Democratic Party policy, not entirely, but largely. And so when it comes down to deference to messaging and messaging priorities in terms of who gets the money of these Democratic Party campaigns, the emphasis is on shifting the party more and more in a corporate direction. That's why in our report, Autopsy, the Democratic Party in Crisis, we focus on how so much money in 2016, and still, even in Virginia, so much money from the Democratic Party goes to messaging supposedly persuadable, so-called moderate Republican voters. And it's a way of saying to people of color, young people, working class people generally, we want your votes, but our policies and our outreach and our messaging will set you aside as being secondary.
I think it's particularly interesting, Donna Brazile's critique, even attack on Obama. I mean, during the Obama years, she was #1 cheerleader on CNN for the policies of Barack Obama. But she called him, Obama and Clinton, she talked about dealing with these two enormous egos. And a lot of people have critiqued Obama for continuing, really, the Bush-Cheney imperial presidency, the idea that the presidency is above the law, above everything else, and in Obama's case, certainly above the party. And the idea of a real party with party structure, in theory, introduces a certain kind of democratic process. And Obama had no interest in that after he had this campaign, his first campaign particularly, but second, which was all about online and mass movement and house parties and small donors. All that went by the wayside once he was president. And I guess part of what Sanders did is he kind of reignited a fight within the party to actually build some party structure. And now we see from Brazile's book, in spite of and against the DNC, which supposedly is supposed to be there to defend party structures.
I think that's right. And I want to recommend to people the cover story in the current issue of The Nation magazine by William Greider, who's been covering the Democratic Party for several decades. And in this piece in The Nation titled What Killed the Democratic Party, he summarizes our autopsy report and quite correctly characterizes it as a call for rebellion and for working people, for young people, people of color, to gain control over the party that in theory represents them and in fact largely does not. And Greider, I think, quite astutely sums up that we have this challenge now to organize effectively, to point out what the Democratic Party really is, not what it claims to be, and to see that there's an opportunity here. We're down in the hole. We do not have a lever to pull that can move the Democratic Party in a progressive direction, and yet there's tremendous organizing going on. And as you referred to, Paul, I think Bernie Sanders did reignite a struggle that has to take place, because, as we say at the very outset of the autopsy report, we have two huge responsibilities in this historic period. One is to fight the right, the racists, the xenophobes, the misogynists, the repressive forces that, according to, and I think he's correct, Noam Chomsky, the Republican Party now is the most dangerous organization in the history of the world. We've got to fight back against the Trump regime and against the Republican control of Congress. And the second responsibility is to move forward a truly progressive agenda that will come from the grassroots, have staying power, and move not only the Democratic Party, but the country in a genuine progressive direction. And the mythology, and we have so many liberals and people like at the clip, Robbie Mook and Hillary Rosen and others, people at Mother Jones piling on, some traditional liberals or some who claim to be progressives. And I remind people, there's an insurance company claims to be progressive. It doesn't mean much of anything, the label. There's an effort to tell people, chill out, calm down, only concentrate on defeating the right-wing Republicans, don't advance a progressive agenda. And there's a claim, explicit or otherwise, that actually those two goals are in contradiction. You know, either you push a progressive agenda or you fight the right. In fact, the opposite is true. And I think the autopsy documents that very clearly.
Okay, well, in the next segment, we're going to go through the autopsy document in some depth. But before we do that, we're going to take some questions from viewers that are sending questions in on Facebook and on YouTube, and I think on therealnews.com and maybe some other places. So if you do want to send in some questions, we're going to spend some time on the questions, and then we're going to come back and do another interview segment with Norman about the autopsy report. So first question, a lot of the questions are kind of pretty similar, actually. But here's the first one that came in. Does the Democratic Party see its errors with going with the Clintons and going against Bernie, and will they look to take a more progressive stance in going forward towards something more classical? I'm not sure what that means, more classical, but is the party going to learn from its errors?
Well, first, classical, I want to interpret it this way. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when he ran for re-election in 1936 as president, he spoke in Madison Square Garden, and he said, "The overprivileged, the wealthy, they hate me, and I welcome their hatred." The message from President Obama and President Clinton before him, in effect, was maybe the overprivileged and the wealthy in Wall Street don't love me, but I want them to love me. That's a fundamentally different sort of a message. I was speaking the other day with a member of the Democratic National Committee who summed up, I think, pretty astutely what we've got when we say the Democratic Party. And this includes a lot of, middle management people and operatives and so forth. Some of them are just dyed-in-the-wool corporate militarists, and that's their commitment. And they would much, much, much rather have a President Bush or even a President Trump than to have a Bernie Sanders. So that's one of the segments. The other is genuine progressives who are really in ascendancy, and according to polling, a majority of the base of the Democratic Party, 52% in a recent Harvard-Harris poll, said among registered Democrats said that they think the party needs to move left. It's a very clear statement. And then there's a third sector, and these are folks who, for whatever combinations of reasons, whether they are inside the party as activists or registered Democrats or semi-attentive observers, they will tend to go which way the wind is pushing and blowing. And we have a responsibility to change the way the wind is blowing so that we can sweep the country and the party along with it in a genuine progressive direction.
Okay, here's another question. What implications do the revelations about WikiLeaks communications with Don Jr. have for the credibility of DNC hacking allegations? I don't know. I guess he's getting at the Russiagate stuff and to what extent WikiLeaks was hacked or whistleblown. I don't know. What do you make of that?
Yeah. Well, I like, and the autopsy does this, to use the metaphor of a train wreck. Let's face it. The November 2016 election was a huge tragedy, one of the most historic ones for the United States in the history of any of our lives. And after a train wreck, you go in, and if you do an investigation that's worth anything, You don't talk about the weather. You don't try to find external sources that had nothing to do with the way the railroad was run. You deal with what happened that was preventable. What are the lessons to be learned? And I think a lot of even Bernie Sanders supporters have been slow to understand that by incessantly obsessing about Russia, real or imagined intervention, the people who have had a hammerlock in a corporate militarist way at the top of the Democratic Party, people who hated the Bernie Sanders campaign, they have been able to divert attention from what should have been the logical questions coming out of the 2016 campaign. And that is, how did Hillary Clinton lose? And the answer is, when you've got a Democratic Party elite that is so tied in with Wall Street, that claims to be fighting for working people, that claims to be on the side of the victims of the corporate capitalist system, and yet is incessantly siding with the victimizers and refusing to name the victimizers of oligarchy, then you don't have a coherent message that makes sense to people if you don't talk about the victimizers as well as the victims. So we have this opportunity to be real about it. And I think, frankly, there's a flinching going on from the top of the Democratic Party. Tom Perez, the chair of the DNC, this is the last thing he wants to talk about. We heard the clip from Robbie Mook. It's just the messages: pipe down, don't talk about those class realities, and we'll all get along just fine.
They're also talking unity, 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 except they're purging some of the Sanders people from the DNC.
Yeah, Paul, there's this quote, I think it's from the tactical military theorist von Clausewitz. He said, every conqueror is a lover of peace. And so the corporate forces that still dominate the DNC and won a close election over Keith Ellison in order to make Tom Perez the chair of the DNC, they are right now the conquerors. So they've got their boot on people's necks and they want us to just chill out. It's not going to happen. There's an uprising around the country that says this Democratic Party has to be taken by the people, taken away from the corporate militarist forces.
People generally, when they talk about this fight in the media particularly, it's portrayed as if it's just an ideological fight between people who believed in sort of a group of leftist assumptions or progressive assumptions, and people who have more centrist, supposedly more pragmatic, more adult, they like to say, assumptions. But it seems to me this is just a reflection of the real fight in the party. I interviewed Bernie Sanders during the primary, and when he was in Baltimore, and I said, you say that the enemy is the oligarchs and the fight is against the oligarchs, but aren't the oligarchs who you're fighting in the Democratic Party? Aren't they oligarchs? And isn't this really a class struggle in the party? And he said, yes, it is, although he doesn't talk that way that often, I guess for more tactical reasons. But this isn't just a fight over opinions. This is a fight over basic interest.
There's a great quote that Bernie gave to the New York Times Magazine about 6 months ago. He said there are people in the Democratic Party who don't mind being on the Titanic as long as they have a first-class cabin. And I think that very much describes what we're dealing with in terms of the top strata of Democratic Party national power. When you look at climate change and just the cataclysmic issues involved with being deferential to big oil, the big energy conglomerates, when you see the destruction of the environment, what's being done to low-income people around this country and ravaging across the planet at the behest of these corporate plunderers, and you look at what's at stake, then you have to question why we should use euphemisms. I mean, I think Bernie is not rhetorical, he's very real. This is progressive populism saying, essentially in the phrase of the old labor song, which side are you on? And that's a very key question. And the answer is coming not from rhetoric. The real answer isn't rhetorical from the Democratic Party. The real answer is in policies and how we run campaigns and what we fight for.
Sue Donham on Facebook writes an interesting question. She says, I remember being aware of all the Clinton money laundering when it happened. Why is this a, quote, new revelation? Nothing new from Brazil. It seems to me there's two parts that are interesting with that, which is a lot of the media, CNN, MSNBC particularly, but others, they're making so much money being anti-Trump, they're not actually all that interested in stories that might be an expose or about the Clinton or Democrats.
Well, more than two sides to any argument is way too complicated for a lot of traditional political journalism. Let's face it, a lot of these accusations, which were accurate when they came from the Bernie Sanders campaign and supporters during the primary battle, they were just blown off and discounted. And as the person who wrote in via Facebook points out, a lot of this was basically known. By the time we went to Philadelphia at the Democratic National Convention, and I was a Bernie delegate, it was very clear, and even months before that, that the DNC was tilted in an unfair way. And then when you look at what actually came out at that point, you have to ask yourself, why is it such a shock? Well, the shock now from the Brazile book is that it's coming from a Clinton supporter. Let's face it, she may have thrown Clinton under the bus because Clinton lost, essentially. But this is the reality that we're looking at. And if we're going to be clear about what is at stake, it's about whether this party is going to function democratically or not. I'd put it this way. We saw in 2016 in real time the severe wounding of democracy inside the Democratic Party. It was the wounding of 1,000 cuts. And what Donna Brazile did in her book is illuminate some of the gore of actually what happened. But it didn't change what we knew to be the case for a very long time.
All right, I'm going to combine two questions that have come in. Chris Chetram on YouTube, why should we talk about trying to, quote unquote, fix the Democratic Party? And another one, which is, how can Bernie not stand up for the people who supported him? This comes from Black Mamba Coffee on YouTube. These YouTube names always get me. He now belongs to the corporate Democrats. So there's a lot of these things tie together, which is the argument goes, the Democratic Party is a corporate Democrats party, and the amount of energy that goes into fighting within it should really be directed towards fighting to create something new, and people should just en masse leave the Democratic Party. You know, there's one campaign to try to get Sanders to do that it really isn't fixable, and that Sanders is actually helping maintain the structure of this corporate Democratic Party because he essentially still represents the Democratic Party, even though he technically runs as an independent, and his fight is directed towards this internal fight in the Democratic Party. And some people are arguing it shouldn't be.
Yeah, let's get real. I mean, with feet on the ground, magical thinking might work in some realms. Magical thinking does not work well in politics. When I go to Germany and I meet with members of Die Linke, the Green Party, as well, the left party and the Green Party, they're in a parliamentary system. And to win even a few percent, 6, 8, 10% of the vote, gets you somewhere, perhaps even some leverage over the national government. In this country, it gets you nowhere whatsoever. And so there's a very real question that has to be asked from the get-go when that sort of a suggestion of a Dem exit comes up. Dem exit sounds fine. Exit to where and to what end is another matter. And the question is, when you look at the imperative to end the Republican majority in the House that gives us a Speaker Ryan, when you look at the imperative to end, hopefully as well, sooner rather than later, the Republican majority in the Senate, such as allowing for Majority Leader McConnell, then what is the real world vehicle, the tool to do that? There is zero real party tool to do that other than through and with the Democratic Party wielding and using it as a tool. So there's a sort of a fantasy world out there that says, oh, we're just going to leave the Democratic Party, by the way, then leaving it into a firmer, much firmer control by and with the corporate militarist forces. And then what? There is not a shred of plausible scenario that by doing that, you do anything but even reduce perhaps drastically, the chances of getting rid of the Republican majority in the House and Senate. So then people are left with the question, does that matter or not? And I think it's an absurd proposition for any progressive to say it doesn't matter whether the Republicans have majority control over the House and Senate. So I think that we need to look at the reality that if you're going to construct a structure, you don't build the roof first. And all these fantasies about a new party and then we run somebody for president for a new party, it's the equivalent of saying, hey, we want to build something, so let's put up the roof first. There's a lot of foundation building that can and should be done, is being done in local races around the country. Progressives are winning with de facto quasi new parties by many different names. They are basically nonpartisan races. So let's get real, do the local work where we have a plausible chance to win.
Okay, we're going to start a kind of new segment, if you will. All of this is going to be put up on our website as separate segments. So we're going to start digging into the report that Norman was part of, which is titled Autopsy, the Democratic Party in Crisis. There it is. So we're going to kind of begin as if this is kind of a beginning of another segment for those of you who are watching live. So here we go. So we're continuing our discussion with Norman Solomon. Norman is the co-founder of RootsAction.org. He's the co-author of the new report, Autopsy, the Democratic Party in Crisis. And thanks for joining us for sticking at it, Norman.
Glad to. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, we're going to start going through this report, Autopsy in Crisis. It begins with an executive summary. And Norman, mention again where people can go to see the whole report.
Yeah, the whole report with all the segments broken out is democraticautopsy.org.
Okay, so we're going to go through some of the points of this executive summary and kind of flesh it out. And then after a while, we'll go back and take viewer questions again about what we've discussed. So the first part begins. Aggregated data and analysis shows that policies, operations, and campaign priorities of the National Democratic Party undermine support and turnout from its base in the 2016 general election. Since then, the Democratic Party leadership has done little to indicate that it's heeding key lessons from the 2016 disaster. I guess that partly goes back to something we discussed in the first part, which is to heed lessons, you have to actually have intent to do something different. But if your policies, which include the Obama economic policies, and Hillary was there promising to continue that legacy, if those policies lead to great inequality, because as you said in part one, your fidelity is to the donor class and who are benefiting from that growth and inequality, then it's not like you made mistakes you're going to learn from. Your interest takes you there.
Yeah, if you want to satisfy your big donors and you want them to be essentially steering the ship with you, and you think, down shoveling coal, so to speak, is the working class that will provide the votes, then that's a pretty good system. And if you can win, well, great. But that means that your attention and your priorities go to satisfying those wealthy donors and the Wall Streets and the big bank interests that they're intertwined with. There's a notable fact, for instance, that came out of these sorts of priorities. When you think about it, it's stunning that between the Obama race in 2012 and the Clinton race in 2016, the Democratic ticket actually lost 5% among Latino voters. Obama in 2012 got 71%, and Hillary Clinton in November a year ago only got 66%. Well, how could that be when Hillary Clinton was running against really an avowed xenophobe, hostile to Mexicans, calling them racist, extremely negative towards and dangerous towards Latino immigrants and Latinos generally. And yet there was a slippage of 5%, which clearly would have made the difference in swing states. And the answer has to do with the messaging priorities and the spending priorities. We quote in the autopsy report a Latino, pretty high-ranking organizer in the Democratic Party nationally, who was, he said, literally begging for $3 million to begin messaging to Latino voters. He got $300,000 instead and ultimately quit in anger and frustration, justified in anger and frustration. And this was replicated again and again. We quote in the autopsy this now infamous statement by the person's now the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, in July of 2016, at the time of the Democratic National Convention. Here, Senator Schumer, this wise supposed leader of the Democratic Party, says point blank that for every blue-collar vote we lose in Western Pennsylvania, we will pick up 2 moderate white suburban Republican votes in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And Schumer added, you can duplicate that in Wisconsin and Ohio. And of course, it turned out to be a horrific strategy, but I think it comes down to priorities. And the priorities of the people in charge of the Democratic Party, unfortunately, are first to keep the donor class in place and to keep themselves personally reelected.
The second point in the autopsy summary, which kind of takes off from what you were just saying, which I personally think is the story of the 2016 elections. There's many things going on, but if you have to isolate one factor of why Clinton lost, I think it's this one. It reads, the Democratic National Committee and the party's congressional leadership remain bent on prioritizing the chase for elusive Republican voters over the Democratic base, especially people of color, young people, and working class voters overall. I mean, I think the great irony of the 2016 election is while Hillary Clinton was chasing Republican voters, traditional Republican voters, with all kind of centrist language, Trump and the Republican Party were focused on chasing lower paid and medium paid working class votes in the swing states. And Clinton thought they had these votes just wrapped up. There's no point even campaigning or spending any money in these places, and spent all their effort, as the report says, on chasing Republicans who in the end vote the way they always vote, which is they vote in the great majority for anyone that says they're going to cut taxes and don't much care about what else the Republican candidate is saying, given how George Bush won a second term after the disaster in Iraq. Again, lower taxes, we don't really much care about anything else. That vote stayed where it always goes. And Trump figured out, or Steve Bannon figured out, that actually they can go and steal Democrat votes amongst sections of the working class, especially when they targeted the swing states.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the Democratic strategy, such as it was, that prevailed was essentially to say, well, there's low-hanging fruit from people of color and working class overall. And so we don't need to bother to put much energy picking that low-hanging fruit. We've got some high-hanging fruit that we think maybe we can reach, which is those so-called moderate Republican white voters. And of course, there wasn't much harvested from that vote. One way to look at it as well, I think one aspect is that ultimately the druthers of the people who have the dominant control of the DNC and the party nationally is they don't want a party that is dominated by people of color, by the young, by the working class energy. They don't want those folks crashing the gates too much. And we say later on in the autopsy, in the section on social movements, that the National Democratic Party, the DNC, cannot bond with the base if they're afraid of the base. And I think it's accurate to say that the people in control of the DNC, they're afraid of the Democratic Party base. They need to keep it at bay, because if the base of the party isn't kept at bay and actually can keep moving into the party and gaining strength, then it will upset the apple cart. And frankly, those people will be out of the job at the top.
Another part of the report, next point in the executive summary, 11% drop in support from black women for the Democratic Party in a survey. And overall in 2016, you say in your report that the vote of people of color went down for the Democratic Party.
Yes, and that survey was co-sponsored by Essence Magazine, and it compared the vote enthusiasm and support for the Democratic Party from its most reliable voting demographic, which is African American women. And that shift from simply 2016 to the next year is stunning. It reflects, it's a marker for the lack of confidence that the Democratic Party has earned. You got to fight like hell with and for people. You can't just throw along some platitudes and assume that that's going to galvanize the base. I think, Paul, there's a tremendous irony that I saw from the floor of the Democratic National Convention, you did as well covering it, and that millions of people saw on television, which is there were many African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans, people of color at the podium during the National Democratic Convention. And it was the effort of the party to symbolically show its affinity with those who are suffering inequities in the society. But then when it came to actually outreach, when it came to pouring money into door to door, which is the best kind of outreach, messaging, advertising, targeting, and also content of policies, it was just shifting and setting aside those sorts of priorities, and instead, as we've been saying, aiming for those who are in other and frankly more privileged demographic groups.
The report makes recommendations for reform. We can go through some of the specific points, but the general objective is democratize the party. This is partly why this fight for who's running the DNC now, Tom Perez, and recently purging people like Zogby and other Sanders supporters. There's supposed to be this unity commission, but as they talk about a unity committee, they're getting rid of Sanders people. The fight, if anything, is getting more bitter. We're trying to report on more of this, but there's fights going on at every level of the party right now, from precinct captains to who's running state Democratic parties. And at every level of these fights, the corporate Democratic leadership, which includes President Obama, who, my understanding, is still very actively involved in all this, is tooth and nail fighting against this Sanders / more progressive section of the party.
Yes, it belies the sort of claim that, let's just pipe down and unite against the Trump Republicans. I have heard from people who talk with former middle-level Obama administration folks, DNC people, who were just astonished at the amount of time and energy and resources going into trashing and denouncing Bernie Sanders supporters. And I think it underscores that this is not ultimately about personalities. It's about economic class. It's about power. And it's about what is the intention as to whose interests will be most represented by the Democratic Party. And I underscore that this is the tool that we have to fight the right and advance and implement progressive policies. Yes, it's a long shot. That's the best shot we have, though, and we have to organize. A lot of things that seemed long shots have become reality. Same-sex marriage equality 5, 6, 7 years ago would have seemed way out of grasp. People organized and raised hell around the country and made it possible. When we look ahead, for instance, December 8th and 9th is the final meeting of what the DNC calls its Unity Reform Commission. And that's going to be another knockdown dragout. It should be. And I want to acknowledge that this independent report, Autopsy, the Democratic Party in Crisis, is intended as a tool to fight back against the corporate oligarchic forces that now dominate the DNC and the National Party as a whole.
We tried to book someone to debate with you on these issues, and we had a great deal of trouble, as we quite often do, getting a sort of DNC defender, Obama / Clinton defender, to come on the Real News Network. If there is one out there who has some sophistication, we want you to know it will be fair. We will give you plenty of time to speak. And we'll keep trying. But given that we don't, I'll try to play that role. So here's an argument that perhaps the sort of Democratic Party elites would make. And maybe not quite in this language, unless they were really on their own and there was no media around. But they might say something like this. The liberal elites, the neoliberal elites, the Democratic Obama-esque, Clinton-esque elites is the best and only hope people have to ward off the far right. That even if you can show, I think they might argue, that Sanders in polling does better than Clinton or some of the others, although a recent poll showed Biden doing almost as well as Sanders against Trump. But when it comes to a real election, don't underestimate how savage the forces of the elites can be. And as we have said, the donor class that supports the Democratic Party would rather see a Trump. I think they'd rather see a completely destroyed Democratic Party than a Sanders presidency or anyone like a Sanders-esque kind of politics. And they're saying, given that reality, that you're living in the heart of the empire, and that these elites have enormous resources, including control of the media, the mass media, that you're naive if you think that kind of social democracy, left liberalism, that it really can win in a country like the United States. And you need us to, whether you consider us center-right or whatever you want to call us, they will argue, we're better than the alternative. And so you should not divide the forces when it comes to holding, the barbarians at the gate. Of course, they're through the gate now.
Well, we heard that array of arguments a year ago and 2 years ago and earlier to try to fend off the Bernie Sanders campaign challenge in the first place. There were many permutations of that argument from 2015 on through the California primary to try to rationalize that support should go to Hillary Clinton, that Bernie campaign was sort of quixotic and not productive. I think of something that C. Wright Mills referred to as crackpot realism, that in its own universe, flying in that constellation, it all is in formation. And if you see or assume the world to be that way, then it sort of makes sense within a cockamamie pattern. But we don't live in times that comport with or actually synced up with that version of reality. We were and are in a crisis and would be no matter who is president. And whether it's climate, whether it's the rising and increasing inequality, whether it's the social dislocation represented by the tremendous drug overdoses happening around this country, you can, the destruction of K through 12 public education, privatization, whatever grid you look at, we cannot simply proceed as though things are more or less required to return to the status quo. It's a status quo argument. It was made more than a year ago by the Clinton campaign, which classically, when the demagogic slogan came from Trump, "Make America Great Again," the response from Obama and Hillary Clinton was, "America's already great," which is, a quintessential status quo argument. Now Democrats are saying we have to go back to the status quo of 2 years ago. Well, so many people don't think fondly of their economic and social predicaments 2 years ago. And what progressive forces are saying is you need to sweep the board in a different way. That's why the kind of progressive populism that Bernie has represented has the power to move forward in a way that the same old time-worn crackpot realism just is not going to be successful with at any real level that we should care about.
Yeah, I think we're at a very interesting moment in history that in many countries, the politics that have been known for many decades is kind of in upheaval all over the world. But go ahead.
I come from the left, identify with the left, but at the same time, this traditional view of left-right spectrum, it doesn't really pan out comprehensively. And part of the mythology that springs from that left-right linear spectrum idea is that when you're fighting the right, somehow you need to keep giving ground and moving more and more towards the right. And that we've seen the failure of that. That's how Democrats lost to Republicans more than 1,000 legislative seats around the country in the 8 years under Obama. And what the Bernie campaign and most importantly, the progressive forces that congealed and propelled around that Bernie campaign, what those forces are all about is to say that we can build a progressive populist movement, social movements that call for inequality to end, that call for social equality. And we can do that in a way that has the real potential to gain a majority in this country.
In terms of learning lessons, does the victory in the governor's race in Virginia and the race in New Jersey, where really centrist Democrats win, is the lesson the corporate Democrats take from that is Trump is so bad, they don't need any more of this Sanders populism to beat Trump candidates?
Yeah, I think that's a very dangerous assumption. Actually, we heard it throughout the spring and summer and fall of 2016, that Trump was largely going to defeat himself, that one outrageous statement or action after another was just other fuel for the engine that was going to destroy him. And we saw how well that worked. You know, he still has a solid base according to polling. And the idea that the progressives of the Democratic Party just need to sort of tip him over because he's about to fall is totally wrong. You don't mobilize the base by telling them that somebody bad has to be defeated. That's part of it. But you have to give the base a reason to turn out and vote. As we say in the Autopsy, young people don't just want a chore to show up. They want something to believe in, something to fight for. And the fall off, for instance, in young people's votes, which was overwhelmingly lopsided for Bernie in the primaries, to the stay at home or in some cases vote third party, young people vote November 2016, that made the difference in the campaign. It will again for people of color, the working class, young people in general. We need to energize the base.
Okay, we're going to keep this discussion going over the next weeks and months. We'll have Norman come back, and we'll have, hopefully, we'll get someone who will defend DNC and defend the sort of current practices of the people who are still in control of the Democratic Party, and we'll have more debate about this. If there's people you would like to see as part of a regular political panel discussing these kinds of issues, please write us at contact@therealnews.com. And don't forget, I guess I haven't said it yet, so how do you forget? But we're about to begin our winter fundraising campaign. We have a $200,000 matching grant, and every buck you give will be matched another dollar. And if you donate monthly, which is really a big deal for us, so we have some idea how much money we have, for every monthly donation, that will be matched with 12 months of value, you can say. So please write in what are some of the questions you would like discussed and debated in terms of what should people do about American politics, but American politics not as you're seeing on CNN, and certainly not all about the Russians are coming, but about what people can do to really fight for their basic interests and how should people fight at the political level. Thanks very much for joining us, Norman.
Hey, thank you, Paul.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.